And really today's session is to take you through some of the modeling concepts in Abacus, which we'll talk about, and how we can best build dashboards to present that information. Now, generally speaking, I know people are joining from all over the globe here as well. So if you have any questions at all, please feel free just to put those into the chat or the Q&A functionality within Zoom, and we'll get time to come to those at the end as well. Now, some of you may be aware that this is actually part of a three-part series on mastering EA modeling, and today is the third part of that series. However, it is worth emphasizing that you don't need to watch the previous two. They can be watched, of course, to get some context potentially, but they can also just be watched in isolation as well. Now, the reason we've produced this three-part series is to really take you through some of the starting points. So how to actually begin the architectural journey. That was part one. So this was talking about specific EA modeling styles, cloud architecture modeling, and a few other aspects and best practices for getting started. Part two took place during our digital summit, and this was how to master capability and process modeling. So taking some of the capabilities in Abacus and narrowing that down and really just focusing on some of the business architecture topics that we found were quite useful during those sessions. And then today's session is really how do we use the models that we've produced? So typically things like diagrams we're drawing, and combine that on dashboards with other visualizations to actually persuade, inform, and inspire someone to make some decisions from the analysis. Now, all of this happens, of course, in Abacus, which you'll see today. But just for those of you who don't maybe know who we are or what Abacus is, a couple of slides quickly to introduce Avolution, the company. So we are industry leaders within analyst reports such as Gartner's MQ, Forrester Wave reports, and the CCA from Gartner. And we've been doing this for over 22 years now. I've been here at Avolution for just over 10 of those years. And really what we're trying to do is provide a tool, in this case Abacus, that can be used by anyone in the organization, and more specifically by users who want specific notations or reference models that they want to leverage. So for example, using aspects like TOGAF, Archimate, BPMN, C4 notations to actually build models and structures to help analyze the organization. We've also highlighted here both a diagram-driven and data-driven approach to modeling, and certainly to EA in general. So of course, today's focusing on both of those, but the previous two sessions were much more heavy on the diagram-driven aspect. But today we do want to take a look a bit more at some of the data-driven side as well. So that's Avolution as a company. And then Abacus as a product is really just split into two sections. So the sections we have here is Abacus Studio and Abacus Enterprise. So Studio is essentially the core tool, and this is where a lot of the configuration and management work goes on behind the scenes, potentially, usually by admins or some key architects. And Abacus Enterprise is really where we want to make it available to everyone in the organization. That's either through read-only licenses, where everyone and anyone gets access, or through some of the modeler or editor licenses we have, where we can actually allow users to contribute to the data sets and of course to the diagrams and the visualizations that are in Abacus. So today's focus is of course going to be slightly more on some of the modeling aspects, and that's something that we're going to dive into in a few minutes. Now for today, really around the modeling aspects, one of the things that we want to emphasize and maybe draw some attention to is the idea that we can actually start building dashboards in Abacus for everyone to leverage. Now, what this really means is dashboards are a collection of visualizations. So we might want to include diagrams, so models we're drawing. We might want to include lists of information, charts highlighting some of the analysis that we've run across those different data sets, and maybe at times more interactive views like graph views to allow users to actually drill down through that data set. And generally speaking, from an EA perspective, we're not just focusing on applications, we're trying to emphasize again this idea of connecting all of these different data sources together. Now, some organizations we work with, of course, do have a particular focus on a particular domain, and that's no problem at all. But generally speaking, when we start looking at EA from an overview perspective, we want to understand how aspects from the business domain, so processes and capabilities, feed into things like the data domain, applications, technology, all the way down to infrastructure, and potentially all the way back up to some level of strategic content that we're modeling. So we don't really want to limit anyone. And of course, as I mentioned at the beginning, there are specific frameworks and notations you can use. For example, TOGAF as a methodology that will, of course, cover a lot of these aspects as well. Now, I really want to make sure that we can dive into the product. So we're going to jump into Abacus and highlight some of the key aspects around the modeler user type, and then drill down into some of the dashboards that we have as well. So when it comes to Abacus Enterprise, which is what you can see here now, it's essentially an environment, like I said, where we can build dashboards and visualizations for different sets of users. But before moving to the dashboards, I do just want to highlight some of those modeling capabilities in here. So a lot of organizations might be using Abacus for process modeling. They may be using Abacus for application portfolio management, and certain users are using very specific notations as well. However, at times, we usually want to combine those things together. So on the left-hand side here, you can see where we've actually used specific notations, such as Azure or C4, or maybe we're using business modeling canvas for some of the strategic content. And we can plug all of those things into a single model in Abacus. And when it comes to using the modeling capabilities in here, what this allows us to do is actually build and edit existing views by directly customizing those within Abacus Enterprise. So this is making use of what we've called the modeler license within Abacus Enterprise. It allows us to essentially drag and drop content onto the canvas. We can search for existing content in the model, and we can then start reusing those, in this case, application components across our diagrams. So it's an important aspect for users to navigate through those views and actually start building that information from a visual perspective. Now we can also start linking these views across to each other. So from a C4 model perspective, we have this high-level context view. Users may want to then drill down into the container view for a particular application to see more detailed information. And we may want to drill down even further to the component level, where we maybe start seeing things like API methods and calls being made, all the way down to the actual functions or modules within that application as well. Now, again, remember, of course, these are just the application views from a C4 perspective. If you are solution architects in here, you may be leveraging the Azure library, and instead you'd be building your diagrams based off that Azure template and stencil. In exactly the same way, we're going to come in to edit these views, and now we have access to the entire Azure library where we can start modeling using that notation. So you're never really limited in terms of the content you want to add in based on these notations. And of course, many of these things will help be, let's say, imported from these external sources. So for example, if you jump onto AWS's website, you'll see us listed there as a supported tool for their notations, and of course, a supported tool to build those diagrams and visualizations as well. Now, I'm aware that a lot of users, of course, may already have their diagrams elsewhere, so we'll certainly talk about that later on as well. But generally speaking, from these diagramming perspectives, when we actually build these are then going to be available to anyone else in the organization who then needs to access them. So we may want to group these into draft diagrams or live diagrams, but again, we're making sure that everyone in the organization can at least see them. And then the modeler users, of course, have access to edit them. So that's generally, from a modeling perspective, a diagram view. However, today what I want to do is jump into more of a dashboard view to highlight some of the benefits of using Abacus from a diagram-driven approach, and then also potentially from a data-driven approach. So what we have here is a dashboard that is actually a templated dashboard. So Abacus provides these template views out of the box, which means as soon as you start using Abacus Enterprise, you'll have these pre-configured dashboards. And in this case, we don't really have any data. So you can see in here, we don't have any applications we've modeled yet. But we can start using the modeling license in here to start creating some content. So let's go ahead and edit this view. And we'll go ahead and add in a new application. And we'll just call this App A. And we'll create this as a new application in our model. Now, this application that we've added in, we'll see that it's essentially an application that has details behind it. It's not just a shape in Abacus. This application has its own set of properties. So for example, it has a hierarchy of where this application sits. We have a description for the application. And then we also have a number of different optional properties we can start filling in here as well. So this is essentially where we can start complementing some of the existing data sets, maybe cost details, maybe recommendation values for the information that we're adding in. Now, what you'll also notice is that each of these views will start populating as we populate the data. So graph view over here is showing we've added a new application. And you'll see as we add more in a few minutes, this will also automatically populate with that data set. We've also got the application designed criticality scores in here. And we've also got a chart showing the BizFit and TechFit scores for this application. In this case, you can see these are currently set to 0. So if we were taking a data-driven approach, we might want to fill these values in. We might also maybe in this case just want to set a criticality value for the application. And maybe we'll also set a recommendation value to maybe invest or retain this application. So you'll notice, of course, this diagram is also now going to be updated with this information. For example, we're showing the criticality as a colored marker in the top right. And we may also be showing other properties such as the color of the shape according to the recommendation. So from a single diagram that we're starting to draw, we can start seeing how this dashboard is going to start building up just by drawing something. Now, of course, the benefit here is if you come from maybe your visual backgrounds, potentially, you draw something in Visio and it exists as a standalone diagram, but it doesn't necessarily mean that all of the other views outside of the tool are going to reflect what's in your Visio diagram. So that's going to be one of the main benefits here is, of course, as we start adding more content, all of these other portlets are then starting to populate with that information. Now, you'll also see, as I mentioned, this graph view. So one of the benefits of graph view versus diagramming, and I would almost treat this as a manual approach to building something versus an automated approach of a data-driven approach, is that this will always be reflecting what's in the repository at specific levels. So we can control the graph view in terms of its style and what components and connections get shown. But the idea is that this is automated in the sense that as we populate, regardless in which manner, whether it's catalogs or diagrams, graph view is going to give us a visual representation of that model. And again, this can be really useful. So let's go ahead and create a connection between these applications. And we'll call this an interfaces connection. Now, if I drill down into application A, you'll now see in here for these applications that we have, that it will start creating that interface connection in here. So again, we can minimize everything in here if we wanted to, or we can actually drill back out of these designs. So if we start adding more applications and more connections, that graph view is then going to populate with that content. Now, one of the reasons this is useful is when we start creating these relationships and start creating these applications, it may not always be our role to start adding this information in, and it may be someone else's role to actually drill down into this data set to see what that information looks like. So we may be designing something and someone else may be navigating through their own views, maybe not even starting from an application layer, but maybe a process layer. And then they can start seeing the content that we've added in. So that's one of the main ways of actually designing some of these diagrams to reflect on graph views, catalogs, and charts, all of that content that we want to show. Now, there are a few other charts in here that we might want to add in or other dynamic visualizations. And one of those is going to be a Gantt chart. So Gantt charts are utilized by essentially choosing which components in the model that we want to display. So we've added some content into this app design folder. So let's just go ahead and add all of those applications into our Gantt chart. Maybe we want to see if there are any interface connections we've added in. And we'll also just use some of these default color styles for the lifecycle dates. Now, each of the applications in the catalog will have their own lifecycle dates. And if we start filling this information in, so let's choose an evaluation date, and we'll go ahead and choose a production date. I would hope in real world situations, your dates are slightly further apart than these for your applications. But you can start seeing now how these Gantt charts are going to be populating with these lifecycle dates underneath. Now, the other main benefit here is if we drill down into App A, we'll see it has the integrations showing in terms of the interfaces it has to other applications. And what we'll also find is App A doesn't necessarily have any lifecycle dates, but it will automatically take those from any of the relationships it has or the hierarchy it has. So we can start aggregating these values up and down the model. This can be particularly useful if you start modeling projects and programs in Abacus, because you want those projects and the min-max states to feed back up to the program level. So that's really how we can start combining some of the diagrams we're building combined with specific visualizations. These don't have to exist in isolation, even if you're taking a focused view, if you like, and just building this diagram on its own. All of this content behind the scenes will be populated with that information. Now, let's just take a look at some of the example dashboards we have in here, just to emphasize the types of models. So if we were, for example, building process views or business architecture views, I've mentioned before there are other types of notations we could be using. And this just gives you a bit of a snapshot of some of those views. So as I've said previously, capability maps from a business architecture perspective are very useful for understanding some of the maturity scores and some of the process scores that you're maintaining in Abacus. High-level strategic views are going to be useful for understanding objectives and goals. And each of these are going to be useful in their own right in isolation. But when we start combining these on a dashboard with other types of visualizations, those diagrams alone become more important when we start using catalogs, KPIs, cost details, and tree maps to allow us to actually navigate and drill down through that model. So when we think of Abacus as a diagram-driven tool and a data-driven tool, this is partly what we mean. So far we've seen some of the strategic content in here, and we've just talked about that data-driven approach. But what I just want to quickly show as one more thing is if we jump into an application portfolio view, and we can start taking a look at what we maybe kind of truly mean, I guess, by these data-driven approaches. And what we'll find in here is a list of applications, and each of these applications have specific properties. So things like criticality values, technical fit scores, which processes use these applications. And some of these applications don't have any attributes. Some don't have business hours and some don't have connections to processes. So one of the things that we can start doing is leveraging the ability to ask Abacus. If I just click on this, this is going to run across this particular row, and it's now going to start looking at the data on this application, and it's going to start suggesting values. For example, which processes should be connected to the application? Are we sure it's the AU Risk and Financial Services department that owns this? Are we confident in the fact that the criticality and number of users is 2 and 2 in this case? So machine learning can actually supplement some of the data. It's also suggesting over here what UI it is. It may also be suggesting specific technologies that should be connected or support this application as well. So that's really the kind of true data-driven approach, where yes, we can draw diagrams and generate data from that. Yes, we can import data from other sources and allow editor users to change the data in here as data owners. But leveraging machine learning and AI in Abacus means we can be slightly smarter about how we actually predict, and in this case, obviously, suggest some of these values. So this machine learning concept will work across any portfolio. It just requires enough data to run.
So you might want to do this for calculating and asking Abacus what maturity scores your capabilities have, or maybe understanding which applications should be supporting particular processes. It doesn't just have to be an APM perspective. You could take this from any type of view you like and leverage some of those machine learning concepts.